All right, here we are. Let's get started. So, in this course, you need to know about content. Very important. Unlike, for example, the Analyzing and Literature course, which doesn't require you to know about certain works of literature or historical context, this test does require that you know about movements, works, and historical contexts. You also need to know about the authors that wrote them. So I just want to stress that this is a content course. When we go through this entire course together, I really suggest that you further some of the readings, you follow the suggestions, you study the modules, and you watch the videos over and over, because this is a content course, and you'll need to know names and places and people and movements, and not just those, but how they all interact. So hopefully with this course, I'll be able to do that with you and facilitate this process for you. Now, the genres mostly covered are novel and short story. There's very little essay, very little autobiography, very little drama. But just a word on that. So, a lot of the stuff that says very little essay. Our idea of an essay is, I'm going to write an essay for my class. But keep in mind that a lot of the things that we're going to be reading may not be considered essays per se, but some of it will be in essay form, because they might be excerpts of philosophical treatises. Maybe, like for example, Thoreau's Walden. You might see something in there that might look like an essay form, because it's definitely not fiction. Autobiography, that's another section there that's not going to be in there, but you do have to know about people. And their relationship and who they are. We are going to see some spiritual autobiographies a bit at the beginning. So there is a little bit in there about that. And drama here. That connection is also made, if you think about it, with sometimes there's an overlap between some poetry and drama. Like in Shakespeare. We're not going to study Shakespeare, but a lot of his poems his dramas were mixed into poems, and there was a lot of overlap though. So I'm not excluding these. I'm just saying that most of it is novel and short story. So here's a breakdown of periods of subject matter. So we've got the colonial, 15% of the colonial and early national period. This is going to be from the very beginning of the Americas all the way up to about 1830. And then after that, we're going to hit the Romantic period. And you'll see the Romantic period stretches about 40 years there. So there's a lot of Romantic period that's very intense at the beginning, but a lot of the writers, the Romantic writers, even though the period had kind of waned, it's still alive, and they kept writing in the style that they knew. And then, in some countries, there's two phases of Romanticism. There's the early and the later phase. We'll take a look at that together. I'm going to also try to explain to you all of these movements and how they react to one another in that sense. We have the period of realism and naturalism, about 20% of that. And you can see that's just at the turn of the century. And that kind of coincided there with the Industrial Revolution, a little bit before that. And you can see how the realism and the naturalism has a good chunk there for 40 years. So that's going to be something that we're going to focus on. That has, a lot of literature was written during that time, a lot of novels and stuff. So we're going to have to look at excerpts and summaries and things like that. 25% the modernist period, 1910 to 1945. We'll take a look at that also. And the contemporary period. Some writers that you may even recognize now that are still alive, we'll take a look at those. And this is American literature. But there's more than that on the test, not just these movements and stuff, but like I explained at the beginning, there's 45 to 6% knowledge of particular literary works, including authors, characters, plot, setting, style, and themes. And we look at these things like the authors, or who wrote the book, who are the main characters, protagonist, antagonist, supporting characters. Some of those are important. For example, when we take a look at the Scarlet Letter, there's a lot of characters in there, but some of the secondary characters are also very, very important. The plot, what's happening with that? Maybe there's a couple of plots, or maybe there's a subplot. The setting, time and space, the time and space where those things take place. When we think about time and space, Like, for example, that's, like Nathaniel Hawthorne was, had written during the Romantic period, but he wrote about 200 years before that, like the Scarlet Letter. When he wrote that, it's based on something way before. So these are things that we need to also keep in mind when we talk about setting, because that also obviously influences the style of the writer. And the style is going to influence very much the period in which it was written. A Romantic style is going to be a lot different from a realist style, but even in those different movements, each author, each writer is going to have his or her own style, that's personal to their characteristics. And even if they have their own style, that style may change over time. Themes, a lot of the themes, the themes are really important because we're going to look at some of the symbolism involved here, some of the metaphors, and a lot of the things that go on that reflect the times. And we'll take a look at that as we move along. 20 to 40% ability to understand and interpret short poems, excerpts from long poems, excerpts from prose works. So short poems, we could see those up on the screen, very easy to take a look at that. Excerpts from long poems, there's a lot of really long epic poems, narrative poems that would be a whole book, that would be a whole, what would a chapter be? It just happens to be in verse form. So we're obviously going to see excerpts from those so we can see how it's written, but then we'll take a look at, a summary of the rest of it so we'll understand what's going on. Excerpt from prose works. We can't have an entire Mark Twain novel here, so we're going to take a look at excerpts that maybe we'll talk about the way the dialogue is written, or maybe the way the language is particular to a particular movement or a particular author. 10 to 15% knowledge of the historical and social settings of specific works. So, obviously at the beginning when we take a look at this with the Pilgrims and the Puritans, and this is very important for the beginning of America, the United States in that sense. And the background is really important. So we're going to take a look at some of the people and what motivated it, because obviously religion played a huge key in the type of literature that was produced. Spiritual biographies, for example. A lot of the stuff that was produced is very is a sign of the times. So it definitely, understanding the context really helps you put things in place. The relations between literary works. So some people might influence other writers. Some people might influence from another movement, if it's an action or a reaction. Those are some things we need to look at. Relations of specific works to literary traditions. So what makes this a romantic writing? What makes this a realist writing? What makes this particularly one way or another? Or, for example, like in the case of Walt Whitman, he's kind of right in the middle between romanticism and realism, philosophical realism. We could take a look at that and see how he has a lot of the subjective qualities of the Romantic movement, but we'll also see how he has this sense of realism because he reaches out to the American public and discusses the whole idea of America. So there's a lot of different, sometimes there's an overlap there. Influences on authors. What influences an author to write a certain way? Obviously, that's religion is going to influence that. They're going to write about God, or later on, when we get to transcendentalism, we'll see the way people are moving away from religion and moving more into transcendentalism, deism, different types of movements we'll take a look at. And that's going to be really important because as people move into a more secular framework, and they're thinking about other things instead. And that's going to be a great focus of what we look at. 5 to 10% familiarity with critical terms, verse forms, and literary devices. We'll take a chapter to take a look at these at the end. A couple of terms, and forms, devices. Is this a sonnet? Some literary devices there. It's good to know, is this a metaphor? Is this a simile? Are they using personification here? Just when you have the sounds together to create a specific effect, What is that? Is that alliteration? Is that personification? What is that? We'll take a look at that later on. So, as you can see, there's quite a bit to cover. So we'll go through the chronology of the works, including the movements, authors, and historical context, as is expected of you all to know. The test has about 100 questions to answer in 90 minutes. There's also an optional essay section in which 2 essays are written in a total of 90 minutes. And more information will be given at the end of the course to discuss the essays in detail.